The AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter. This is AmericasDemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, author Annelise Orleck on how poverty wages have sparked a worldwide labor movement. Historian John Russo on the populist economic agenda that Democrats need to win back the working class. Plus, Bill Press talks with Joe Cirincione about what Donald Trump might accomplish in sitting down with North Korea's Kim Jong-un. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Historian Annelise Orleck traveled the world to write a book about workers who live on poverty wages. What she found gave her a renewed sense of hope and possibility. And we say hello to Annelise Orleck, who's a professor of history at Dartmouth College and the author most recently of We Are All Fast Food Workers Now, the Global Uprising Against Poverty Wages. Annelise Orleck, thank you so much for joining us today on AmericasDemocrats.org.
Thank you for having me.
Well, our pleasure to have you with us. Your book is a remarkable account of low-wage workers across the globe. How did you do your research?
I did my research in all kinds of ways. Interestingly, one of the ways that I found people was the same way that this new movement has found each other, and that is social media. I began to look for references about strikes and uprisings and new kinds of protests as part of this rising global labor movement. And I Facebooked people, I texted them, I Twittered and reached out all of those ways, and in so doing was able to make contact with people from South Africa to Baja California to Providence, Rhode Island. After that, we traveled around the world. I traveled with photographer Elizabeth Cook, who did original photographs for this project, and we did interviews in union halls. We did them in the midst of protests in the streets. We did them in faded old colonial hotels. We interviewed people by phone, by Skype, in person, and in many, many languages. And, we traveled on planes and buses, but also in open-air tuk-tuks in Asia on the backs of motorcycles. It was a pretty adventurous research process.
Wow. It actually sounds like a lot of fun on top of everything else, just to have that type of experience. And across this expansive stretch of experience, what kind of similarities did you see in the way that low-income work affects people's lives?
Well, one thing that became clear is that there have been some larger changes that have happened as a result of neoliberal capitalism in the last 30, 40 years. So here are the issues. Everywhere I went, people were protesting what they called contractualization, or what we call the gig economy. And what that means is that nobody's an employee anymore. Everybody's a contract worker. We are all fast food workers. What does that mean? 100 years ago and into the middle of the 20th century, most countries passed labor laws protecting workers, maximum hours, overtime pay, safety standards. By making everybody an independent contractor instead of an employee, corporations have done kind of an end run around labor protections for workers. So that's one thing. They're having to fight to win back the rights that workers fought for and won in the early 20th century. The next thing is that there's a real fight against the abuse of workers on the shop floor. Most low-wage workers are women, and so everywhere I went, they were fighting sexual violence in the workplace, sexual harassment, pregnancy discrimination. They were fighting for wage equity between male and female workers. So, there's that piece of it that to a large degree, although by no means exclusively, this has been a women's movement. And, finally, there's a real race to the bottom. What global capitalism means is that, for example, workers in Cambodia told me they were constantly threatened with the factories just picking up and leaving and moving to Bangladesh, right? They said employers would say, if you insist on higher wages, we'll just, close up shop and move someplace else where it's cheaper. And interestingly, now that Bangladeshi workers have been organizing so effectively since 2010, and they've raised their wages by many times, and they've been able to get hundreds of global corporations to agree to something called the Bangladesh Fire and Safety Accord, which mandates factory safety inspections and mandates that the global brands actually make repairs on the factories where they make their clothing. Since that time, we've gotten, this expansion even further. And so, there have been recent reports on how Ethiopia has become, the new fast fashion engine, because there are not the kinds of labor protections there that there are other places, but they're organizing there too. And finally, the one other thing that's really unites workers worldwide is they work for the same corporations. So, many of these workers, garment workers around the world are all making clothes for H&M, for Walmart, for Gap, for Zara. And, as far as fast food workers, McDonald's is the second largest private employer in the world. Walmart is the first, right? And so they've begun to organize together with workers who work for the same global corporations, because they realize that the only way to make a difference, to be felt, when you protest against such global behemoths, is to organize transnationally, and that's exactly what they've been doing.
Interesting. Well, and of course, the thread that holds this together in your book is the impact of global capitalism. What did you learn that you didn't already know about global capitalism in writing this book?
Well, one of the things that really struck me is, I've been politically observant all my life, and I'm a political historian. It's what I do for a living. And yet I was really struck by the extent to which these changes took place in my adult life, and I missed them, right? I did not see it. And so I think one of the things that really struck me is that we've had the emergence of these global corporations and global supply chains that are so complicated that one of the first things workers have to do when they organize is figure out who they're working for, because they know they're not really working for the farmer in whose fields they labor, or even the garment factory owner in whose shop they make hundreds of shirts or pairs of sneakers or jeans in a day. Who they're really working for are the global brands, and the global brands intentionally make their supply chains complicated so that it's really difficult to trace who has the real power in these global supply chains. That's intentional, and also so they have plausible deniability. So Kalpana Akhtar, who's the leader of the Bangladesh garment workers movement, has talked about having to go in after factory fires in Dhaka and literally put her fingers in the still hot rubble and find invoices and labels so that she can then go to a Walmart or a Children's Place in the United States and say, you were there, because these corporations deny it. Of course they deny it. They don't want to have to pay reparations. They don't want to be sued. And so that's been, for me, really a surprise, is how much this process has been about making the invisible visible. For hotels, it's the same thing, right? We think of all these global hotel chains as being run, by one corporation, but, in fact, hotel chains have become this site for equity investment firms. Capital goes in and out, and the people who really run them are these hotel management firms. And, the people who clean hotel rooms are maybe the most invisible of all workers, right? We all imagine, as organizer Massimo Frattini in Geneva said to me, we all imagine that we leave the hotel room and a ferry comes in and makes it beautiful again by the time we come back that evening. Of course, it's real people. It's very, very hard on people's bodies. And so they've really worked to make themselves visible, and including some very creative kinds of protests. For example, a bed-making demonstration in Harvard Square when the workers of the Doubletree Harvard Square were trying to organize, and they wanted to get, people in the college to pay attention to them. They had to come out of the rooms, out of the hotels, into the street, and literally help people try to make beds the way they have to make, 20, 30 beds a day, so that people could see how punishing it is on their bodies. So I think this making the invisible visible has been really important. The field workers who pick tomatoes are currently fasting in front of the United Nations in New York because, they're trying to bring attention to sexual harassment and sexual violence in the fields. So again and again, these low-wage workers have had to fight their own invisibility, and that is really surprising and moving to me.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Annelise Orleck, professor of history at Dartmouth College and author of We Are All Fast Food Workers Now, the Global Uprising Against Poverty Wages. Annelise, another link you find across the globe is that of resistance. You touched on a little bit of it right there. You write about small successes that can be models for change. So what are some of those small successes that we need to know about?
Well, there are three things going on right now that I think are really important. The first is that out of the Los Angeles Alliance for a New Economy, which is one of the most creative progressive think tanks in the country, came a new organization called Jobs to Move America. And the idea was that you can take advantage of procurement budgets that cities have because cities spend a lot of money on things like mass transport, buses, trains, trucks. And so this organization has forged agreements with Los Angeles, New York, and Chicago, and in so doing have brought unionized heavy manufacturing back to those cities. And what they were able to negotiate is that the cities would agree, the city departments of transportation would agree to enforce in the contract bids, to give the contract bids to companies that agreed to A, make a sizable percentage, produce a sizable percentage of the trains, buses, trucks, in the city or right near the city, B, that they would be produced in an environmentally sensitive way and would be environmentally cutting-edge vehicles, and third, that they would be union jobs, and fourth, and that the unions would train workers for those jobs. Fourth, the people who would be trained would often be people who had really big obstacles in the way of their employment. So, women of color, former vets, former cons, people who have a really hard time finding work. And so it's very exciting. You've got trains being made on the south side of Chicago again. You've got really depressed areas outside of LA where electric trucks are being made. And they're being made through these kinds of contracts. So that's one model that I think is really important because there was so much rhetoric in the 2016 campaign about bringing manufacturing jobs back to the United States, to cities in the U.S. This progressive organization in Los Angeles is doing it, and they're doing it in really positive, environmentally friendly ways, gender equitable ways. I think that's a very exciting model. Here are a couple of others. The Villa Altagracia project makes logo wear clothing for 800 colleges and universities in the United States. This was a town in the Dominican Republic where there were these garment factories owned by foreign capital, in that case, Korean, I believe. And the workers had been trying to unionize for years, and they traveled to the United States. They made common cause with United Students Against Sweatshops, and consumers supported them, and eventually they were allowed to organize, to unionize. But then, as so often has happened in this new system, global capital fled, and the factory shut down, the town withered. Well, this guy, Phil Knight of Knight's Apparel, which makes uniforms for the National Hockey League, had a lot of tragedies in his family, and he said it made him come up and think about himself and what he is doing with his life besides making money. And he decided to open up a test project called the Villa Altagracia Project. And these are factories, garment factories with union jobs. Workers have health care. They're now people who are living in huts are living in houses with running water and electricity. Their kids get help trying to go to college. And this corporate, this responsible corporation is now, they partnered with United Students Against Sweatshops on these various campuses, and they partnered with Barnes & Noble, which runs a lot of campus bookstores, to create this label. Right, so that when students go in and buy logo wear for these 800 colleges, they know that it's being made in a humane way by union workers under safe conditions. And so I think Villa Altagracia is really an example of something that could be scaled up, right? If a relatively small clothing manufacturer could make a profit doing it, and they've just started to make a profit. They had to go a few years without. Then I think this is really a model that can be scaled up. And then I think another success is there are a couple of different kinds. One of these producers cooperatives all over the country and the world. I visited some grape co-ops in South Africa where people are growing grapes in the townships. And I think for berries, there's a really interesting farm in California called the Swanton Berry Farm, which is both unionized and organic. And they are part of a project that tries to bring union organic grown produce for sale in poor districts of their state, right, for sale for affordable rates. Workers are paid in part in shares of the companies so that when they leave, they'll be able to retire. As a result, they stay on these berry farms for a really long time. And, it's one of the most stable workforces in agriculture. And so I think there are a lot of these kind of small successes that I think we need to look at. There are some zero-waste garment companies because fashion is a very dirty industry. There's a whole lot of going on that I think people should know about. And the final thing, maybe the biggest, is something called worker-led social responsibility codes. A lot of corporations have corporate social responsibility codes. They're worth only so much. But these worker-led codes that were pioneered by the Coalition of Immokalee Workers in Florida and that have come to turn the Florida tomato fields from the worst agricultural workplaces in the country to the very best, is now being used by Vermont dairy workers. They just got Ben & Jerry's to sign on. And what it is the big buyer at the top of the supply chain, Ben & Jerry's or Taco Bell, who buys the most tomatoes, or H&M, who buys the most clothes, they agree that they will pay a little bit more from their suppliers for a premium product, that this extra money will also help to pay for outside safety inspections, and to negotiate grievances around sexual assault and violence, and to fight slavery, labor slavery in these workplaces. This, to me, is one of the most promising new strategies, and I think it's taking over and is one way that we're going to see, really different kinds of conditions and wages around the world.
Well, and those are all of those are wonderful examples. And the one thing I think is really important to point out is that you just gave examples of both small companies and large corporations that can make this happen. So I think that's a very, very positive sign indeed. As we listen to Donald Trump, Annelise, talk about tearing up trade deals and imposing tariffs, what does that mean for low-wage workers?
I think that there is no question that trade agreements like NAFTA and the Trans-Pacific Partnership had devastating effects on low-wage workers. I mean, what NAFTA did to small farmers in Mexico, as well as to American manufacturing workers, on the northern side of the border, was devastating. The thing is that the ways in which Donald Trump is going about, rethinking these trade deals has nothing to do with benefiting workers, right? These tariffs are, not thought through. They are, as is always the case with every economic policy that he comes up with, they're packaged to sound like they benefit workers when in fact they benefit corporations. I think if you really wanted to renegotiate NAFTA, and there are all kinds of reasons that you should, for environmental disasters, for the preservation of, the diversity of corn crops in a state like Oaxaca in Mexico, which have been devastated by GMO American corn and as it flooded into the country after NAFTA. If you want to renegotiate, then you've got to put the right kinds of stakeholders at the table. It's not something you can just rattle off at the end of at the end of a meeting with manufacturers in answer to a quickly asked question by the press. So do we need a new trade regime? Absolutely. But I think we need one that is not geared toward destroying organized labor. We need a vision much more like the Franklin Roosevelt vision, in which you had labor, manufacturers, and consumers together at the table. I'm not saying that regime was perfect by any stretch, but that's the kind of vision and structure that you would need to renegotiate the trade deals that have devastated our world in the last 30, 40 years. And I do agree that there's been tremendous damage as a result of the World Trade Organization tribunals and the loan policies and project policies of the World Bank and the IMF. There's no question about that. But Donald Trump's tariffs are not the answer.
Right. Well, and it's also, if fix it if it's broken. You don't necessarily have to throw out the entire thing. We're speaking with Annelise Orleck, professor of history at Dartmouth College, author most recently of We Are All Fast Food Workers Now, The Global Uprising Against Poverty Wages. Annelise, in another interview that you did on this book, you said this about the people you interviewed, quote, "They taught me that our inward-looking grief after the election of Donald Trump was a sign of our privilege, that we have to keep on fighting no matter what." Can you expand on that?
Yeah, I mean, I interviewed people who were, rising up and going into the streets, after Rodrigo Duterte was elected in the Philippines. The tremendous courage that it takes to go up against someone who, will shoot you as soon as look at you, really, really stunned me. And a lot of these are very young people, and one of them even said to me, we're too young. We can't afford to be afraid, right? This is, the movement is my life. She said, it's my music, it's my rhythm, and you can give me 1,000 reasons to leave it, and I will give you 1,000,000 why I have to stay on. I spoke to a 27-year-old activist and organizer of hotel and casino workers in Phnom Penh, Cambodia. And, going up against the Hun Sen regime in Cambodia is no joke either, as one of the longest-serving heads of state in the world, and also a man very willing to use violence to preserve his hold on power. He has, and he will. And she said, I know I could die. I know I could die in this struggle. She said, but that's okay. She said, it really is. I'm not just saying that. It's really okay if I could begin to bring change. And another organizer there said to me, after the Phnom Penh, we deserve a real democracy, and we will put our lives on the line for it. So I think that in meeting with these workers, I think in watching the workers, the 50,000 or more who went on strike in Baja California, the berry pickers, some of the poorest workers in the world, and who shut down that Trans-Pacific Highway from Baja into California, where the berries get shipped into the United States. Their bravery is tremendous. Again, they're beaten by police, shot at, and I think that their insistence on continuing the struggle is a real lesson to all of us here in the United States. And I think also that African American and Latinx organizers here in the United States also, especially undocumented workers and organizers, really also put in perspective our grief about the Trump election. I spoke to a 21-year-old organizer and activist, an African American guy in Las Vegas, Stretch Sanders, who said to me, this was the day after the election. He said, I'm scared. But he said, I'm not that scared. My brothers and sisters were already being shut down in the streets by police who should know better. My undocumented coworkers were already having knocks on the door, and families were already being broken up with parents taken with their kids, didn't know where they could find them. He said, this struggle's been going on a long time, and we can't stop now. So all of those people gave me hope, and they gave me strength, and I just try to live up to their courage.
So you just mentioned hope, and you have said in the past this book left you with a feeling of hope. Why hope?
Well, because they've achieved a tremendous amount in a very short time. So for 40 years, wages have been stagnating, and in fact, the real buying power of wages has been dropping precipitously. But since 2012, workers just in the United States, low-wage workers, have through passing local and state legislation, through getting private corporations to agree as a result of their protests to raise the minimum wage, have won $61.5 billion in wage raises in just 4 years, right? That is 12 times the raise that Congress gave low-wage workers the last time it raised the federal minimum wage in 2007. It went into effect in 2009. You've had wages have increased by many times all over the world, in South Africa, in Cambodia, in Bangladesh, in Mexico. So wage increases are happening, and the only reason they're happening is because of this vast organizing and the kinds of protests and the savvy use of social media to publicize these protests that these workers have made. I think it's really important to say that protesting in this day and age is very different than protesting was even 10, 12 years ago, right? Was something between 10 and 15 million people protested around the world before the start of the first Gulf War. The second Gulf War, 2003. But there was very little coverage of it, right? Now people publicize their own events, right? I've watched people post videos of protests onto social media and messages and download images of protests in other parts of the world. It's a new era. So all of this gives me hope, but I think also there's something about the poverty wages that so many people are laboring under today that's soul crushing, and the kinds of disrespect. I think it's really crucial that many of the organizations that I looked at are called Respect. In the Philippines, the Fast Food Workers Union is called the RESPECT, Fast Food Workers Alliance. The Walmart Workers Organization in this country is called Organization United for Respect at Walmart, our Walmart. I saw this again and again everywhere I went, and I think workers are giving themselves that respect. They're earning that respect by winning concessions. Some of them are huge. I mean, the fact that they won this huge increase in the minimum wage in the states of New York and California, the two biggest labor markets in the U.S., that's huge. Is it enough? By no means. As LaFonza Butler, who's one of the union organizers who was the co-chair of the Living Wage campaign in L.A., said, nobody's going to Vegas on $15 an hour. It's $31,000 a year, even if you work full-time. But if you win it for yourself, you get a sense of respect and a sense of belief that you can bring change that fuels further action. And I think that's what gives me hope. There is change happening. It's not happening overnight. It's not enough yet, but change is happening, and it's potent and it's powerful. And even the Me Too movement, right? Long before we were hearing from Hollywood actresses, these workers around the world were campaigning for global UN resolutions and International Labor Organization conventions banning sexual violence in the workplace. That's amazing. And if they win it, it will change our world, and it will change individual lives in workplaces, from New York to Cape Town.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. Great stuff. Annelise Orleck, professor of history at Dartmouth College and author of We Are All Fast Food Workers Now, The Global Uprising Against Poverty Wages. Annelise joining us today on americasdemocrats.org. Professor, we appreciate your time with us, and we do and hope that you can join us again soon.
I hope so. I'd love to talk with you more. Thank you so much for having me on.
You're quite welcome. Thank you. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing or one time. in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, a conversation with labor historian John Russo on what Democrats need to know about the working class. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
The Koch brothers believe that their great wealth entitles them to rule over the many. So, for decades, they've been running a surreptitious assault on the rules that protect the majority of us from their abuse. From whacking our voting rights to busting unions, their plutocratic intent is nothing less than to pull a coup on democracy, installing a government of, by, and for the super-rich. They've enlisted a secretive cadre of other billionaires who share their extreme kleptocratic belief that 1, property rights of the rich are more important than the people's political rights. 2, that majority rule is not a good form of governing. And 3, that the makers, as the billionaires dubbed themselves, should be able to overrule collective actions of the lower classes, whom they call takers. They've created a complex, sophisticated web of right-wing front groups that have already corporatized a slew of our most basic laws and institutions. And they've gained a chokehold on nearly every level of government, including our courts and whole states like Wisconsin, North Carolina, and Texas. To carry out their attacks, they've essentially taken over the Republican Party. Even more shocking than the arrogance of this unprecedented power grab by the conspiracy of billionaires is its quiet success. The Koch coup crept up on us because it abhorred publicity and couched each move as an independent effort by a separate group. Then, the conspirators backed the Supreme Court's outrageous 2010 Citizens United decision, decreeing that unlimited corporate spending is allowed because it's, quote, free speech. Only then did Americans begin waking up to the reality that the Kochs were making an assault on democracy itself. This is Jim Hightower saying, to learn more, check out the extensive Koch web files at the Center for Media and Democracy at exposedbycmd.org/Koch.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. John Russo has spent decades writing about America's working class. And if Democrats want their vote, he says, nothing short of a bold economic and populist agenda will do. And we say hello to John Russo, visiting scholar at the Kalmenovitz Initiative for Labor and Working Poor at Georgetown University. He's the former co-director of the Center for Working Class Studies and coordinator of the Labor Studies program at Youngstown State University. He's also managing editor of the blog Working Class Perspectives and co-author with Sherry Lee Lincoln of Steeltown, Work and Memory in Youngstown. John Russo, thanks so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
It's a real pleasure.
And our pleasure to have you with us. In a recent article titled, Have Ohio Democrats Learned Anything About the Working Class?, you point out that the failure of the Democratic Party to win back support of white working class voters in Ohio, in part, you say, because they're focusing on the wrong message. What are you hearing that misses the point?
There's 2 things you really have to consider. First of all, what happened over the last 20 years in Ohio, where a lot of the Ohio Democrats were really focusing on sort of what I would call Republican-light types of policies. And the result has been catastrophic for them. They've lost control of most statewide office races other than what happened in 2006 on the heels of a Republican scandal. And so the state has become a red state instead of a purple state. And everybody is really quite surprised by that. But if you look at the sort of the background and the policies that have been used by the Democratic candidates, they fall far short, especially for those that are part of the working class. And I don't just mean the white working class, I mean the total working class. Mm-hmm. And I think that you could see that sort of evolving, in 2016, where I predicted in March of 2016 that Trump was going to win Ohio, and there were a lot of Democrats who were quite mad at me for projecting that. But then I went ahead and wrote a piece in the Cleveland paper that basically said, what Hillary has to do to win the working class. And sort of went through, first of all, the history of what had been going on and say that they really had to change his sort of policies and be much more direct in terms of trade issues, acknowledging we lost the trade war for all intents and purposes, yet Clinton should have used every legal means, promised to use every legal means at her disposal to protect American workers and industries from the onslaught of imports, and also asked to initiate trade cases against countries that target American industries. Make a much stronger appeal to strong infrastructure programs, but not just the appeal itself, but also say how it was going to be funded. Making college more affordable for working class people and people living in poverty. Even though everybody doesn't need a college degree, most working people really want their kids to have a college degree and more education. And then also some things about dealing with some of the retirement issues that have been coming up with these 401ks that have not been, that have replaced the disappearing pension programs. These are all things that were real concrete things that they should take up. And of course, they took up none of those. But if you hear in that sort of litany of things, there's a lot of the things that Trump did, and he's still doing right now. I mean, Trump still has a great deal of appeal in the state of Ohio, especially after what he's done in terms of trade policy. So they failed to do that. So what I tried to do in this article is I wanted to go and see what the current candidates were saying, and what I found is that they were not saying very much, especially the gubernatorial candidates. Richard Cordray, and to a lesser extent, Dennis Kucinich even. So, and I said that they should really take a much more populist tone, more similar to Bernie Sanders, I think, than to Hillary Clinton, and really try to address the concrete economic issues that are facing working people in the state of Ohio. I haven't seen that yet, and I sort of continued to look for it. And I said if they needed a model for which they could sort of use is to go to Sherrod Brown's website and see a 77-page document that specifically talks about an economic platform that would really be helpful to the working classes. The title of those white papers, Working Too Hard for Too Little, Plan for Restoring the Value of Work in America. And I think that it was a really great model that they could use. I also said that they could go to Ohio Policy Matters, which is a nonpartisan think tank, and who has a white paper called A New Way Forward that outlines 10 ways that to support Ohio's working people. And so there's models out there, but they haven't done it. And they hope that they might address it, but the longer that they wait, I think the harder it's going to be for them to push that by the time we get rolling toward the general election, because a lot of working people in Ohio won't suspend their disbelief in Democrats. They just believe that a lot of the Democrats are Republican lights, and they haven't promised or fulfilled the promises that they made in the 80s and 90s, and to a lesser extent in the early part of the century. So it is a critical article, and boy, I know that I've got enough heat from it. But the point of it is that they really need to take a much more progressive line, or I think the Republicans are going to continue to win in Ohio. And what's dangerous this time around is a lot of the key legislative positions will determine the census data and redistricting that's going to occur. So, which already has been great since 2010, and that the Democrats will have a difficult time winning before 2030 if they don't do well this time around.
And not everyone is doing it wrong based on your article. And you mentioned former Congressman Dennis Kucinich and current Senator Sherrod Brown. What is it that Kucinich isn't doing or hasn't done and Brown is? I mean, it kind of surprises me that somebody like a Dennis Kucinich wouldn't be out there in the front, a la Bernie Sanders.
I think it really has to do with how concrete their proposals are. Everybody's going to try to promise more jobs, greater protections for workers. But specifically, only Brown has given them a litany, a document that says, here's what I'm going to do. And he has a different type of credibility. He has talked about these things, and he has walked the walk. And Dennis is if you go to his website and just look at what he's saying, it's much more general, but better than Cordray's, who's just basically you punch a button and, and say, here's who I am, and here, donate here. We just haven't seen anything out of Cordray yet. So, and this is a strategy. I mean, you have to sort of understand that, staying away from these issues, trying to maybe just go after the Republicans and Trump, that's sort of going for talking points about the current administration, isn't going to travel very far with a lot of working people. And now that Trump's tax cuts, now people are poo-pooing, it's not very much and all that, but for a lot of working people, $1,000 is a lot of money. And of course, the Republicans are trying to get that word out. But if you talk to working people, they know the bulk of the money is going to go to the really wealthy, but they'll benefit some from getting some money because they haven't had wage increases in years. And so that's, the Republicans are, I sort of, or not, I shouldn't say Republicans, Trump understands this. And he's captured that sort of voice and resentment of working people and saying, these are things I'm doing to help. Look what I'm doing on trade. Look what I'm going after China. And you see somebody like Sherrod Brown who said, yeah, I agree with Trump on this issue. Or my representative, Tim Ryan, saying, yeah, I agree with Trump on this, on the trade issue and what he's doing, not necessarily all the ways he's doing it. Or Connor Lamb saying, I agree with Trump on certain issues. And then running also against the party itself on many issues, because there is this deep sense of resentment about the Democrats and that have gone on for a number of years, especially through the Rust Belt area. It is really the politics of resentment about what's happened, their way of life, their standard of living, what's happening for their kids. But it's not just the past that happened, the loss of industrial jobs and the old steel jobs. It's also what happened in 2008 and 2009 and the Great Recession or lesser depression, depending on what you want to talk about, where people lost their health care, lost their pensions, they lost their jobs. They had to take jobs that were not as good as their former jobs, and any sort of a sense of recovery for these Rust Belt communities, especially all along the northern tier of Ohio, was such that nobody really wanted to do very much about it for them. And so no wonder that a type of pseudo-populist message by Trump came along, and it sounded pretty good to them.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking to John Russo, managing editor of the blog Working Place Perspectives and co-author with Sherry Lee Lincoln of Steeltown, Work and Memory in Youngstown. John, you mentioned Connor Lamb and looking at that recent victory in Pennsylvania and his support from organized labor. Do you think Democratic strategists are rethinking their strategy, and should they be looking at what he did there to rethink that strategy?
I think that's part of it. I mean, I think there's a lot of resentment toward the Democratic Party among the labor unionists. And that really, it goes back to 1992. In 1992 in Ohio, and I'll get back to Pennsylvania in a second, in Ohio, the labor movement and the community groups organized an incredible amount on the, at the grassroots. And the result was they helped Clinton get elected. But within 3 years of that election, you had NAFTA, you had criminal justice reform, and you had welfare reform. I remember going to the out to the automobile plants in the Youngstown area in 2000, and the shop chairman and president trying to convince the workers that they should vote for Gore. And the workers were adamant. They said to them, you promised that anybody who voted for NAFTA, we're going to go after. And that's what we're doing. They were going after Gore because Gore was a spokesperson for a good part of NAFTA. And they said, we're going to vote guns, gays, and God. It was real clear to them they were going to punish the people that were voted against their sort of self-interest. And so the labor union community suddenly got very split between the craft unions, the public sector unions, and the industrial unions over what would be halfway decent policy. In Ohio, they came back together around SB 5 in 2011 and 12. But there's still this sort of arm's length relationship right now that some of the unionists have toward the Democratic Party. In an area like western Pennsylvania and where Connor Lamb was running, there's still a large union component, and the unions really did get behind Lamb and did an enormous amount of organizing. But that's a very unique area because there's a lot of unionization that's already been done there. But what's been different, and you got an interview with the Financial Times on this, is that the organizing that went on was out of the unions. It was not with part of the Democratic Party apparatus. There was an arm's length relationship between the types of organizing that was going on between the unions and the Democratic Party and the state party, and to lesser extent, the county party. And then you heard Connor Lamb say, I'm not going to vote for Nancy Pelosi, right. and things like that. Always keeping sort of a distance from the Democratic Party apparatus. And at the same time saying, well, I support, Trump on certain issues like trade issues. So he sort of captured the zeitgeist, if you will, of the people that were in that particular area. And the unions played a very critical role in terms of helping him get elected in that largely Republican area. But there's also a lot of resentment. You have to remember in that area because of the former councilman or former representative who was forced to resign over his abortion comments, and he was against abortion, that he told his girlfriend that she had to get one, and that contradiction and that hostility, especially within the largely religious communities of Western Pennsylvania, didn't help the Republicans at all either. Sure. But so there were just a lot of issues that were going through that particular race. I take certain things out of it, and then other things I say just are not applicable to other races.
Mm-hmm. In another recent article, you and your wife, Sherry Lincoln, write about the lessons we should be learning from Doug Jones's victory in Alabama. And you write that, quote, the election reminds us that Democratic candidates will not attract the votes they need solely through campaigns focused on economics, close quote. Tell us more about that.
Well, the idea of it is, having talked about, you have to run much more of a populist campaign. But at the same time, you can't lose the centrality and the importance of race and gender in the country itself. And that they're going to need to attract votes, especially from the various minorities communities. And they must take real strong stands against racism and sexism and injustice. And it's just, for those of us who study working class life and culture, we understand that you can't privilege any one of these types of identities. You have to understand that they are all part of us. We have a racial identity, we have a gender identity, we have a class identity, we have a religious identity, we have a place identity. And how we vote often reflects one or more or some combination of those different identities. So you can't just do it straight, economics either. You have to sort of root your campaigns in much more broadly, but with a populist undertone to them. So I think that was important, and you can see it right now, given what's happened on the gun issue. The guns and legalization, the gun control laws are going to be addressed in this campaign. There's a lot of younger people that this is a really critical issue. And I'm sort of playing with an idea about talking about Ohio. Once again, we have Richard Cordray, who has an A1 rating with the NRA, yet at the same time, the Republican candidate has a C rating from the NRA. And now some people say, well, that's good that Cordray has taken a certain position and taking money from the NRA. But among a lot of younger people, as we saw in terms of a lot of the TV coverage and those of us who were at the event, there's going to be a lot of people who are going to see that and they're going to say, another Democrat, we're not going to vote for him. So how they sort of play that is another one of those issues that's not necessarily economic, but a moral and ethical type of discussion that's going to be part of this upcoming campaign. So you can't make it all just economics, but my own view is that they have to stress a much more populist economic tone if they want to win in Ohio.
Well, and before we let you go, let's talk about another thing to appealing to racial injustice in a political campaign. Always seems to raise concern for some that this could, in fact, drive away white voters. So what's your response to that concern?
It's going to drive away some white voters regardless. Racism is a part of this country. It's part of its DNA. And you have to be able to stress economic and social justice as part of your campaign for economic justice. They all are intertwined very much. And so you have to sort of, walk that line between that. You can't deny it because if you don't want to talk about it, somebody else is. And you have to sort of get into that discussion. All right, this is what we believe in. This is what we should do. Here are the concrete things I'm going to do. Every time, I'm at Georgetown 9 months of the year, and then 3 months of the year, I live in Youngstown. I go back to Youngstown. It gets us grounded. We talk to people on how they're living their lives and what they're feeling about electoral politics. And racism is part of it. Okay, there is a racial element of this. At the same time, there's a lot of people in this country and working people that are not racist. And there are certainly a large number of the minority community that certainly want racial justice as part of that discussion. And what we found in terms of the campaign down in Alabama, that don't seem to have the right tone in terms of talking those issues. He understood. He wanted younger voters. He wanted African-American voters. He had an economic agenda. Of course, he was running against a pedophile. That made things a little bit easier. But you have to sort of recognize the what we said about the horrors of moving back to sort of a pre-civil rights era type of America. And there are influences out there that really want to turn back the clock. But I think the social justice continues to march forward, and we may have hit a plateau. But I think that ultimately, I sort of really believe that Americans really do believe in social and economic and racial justice, and that that's you have to talk about it. So it's not just economic; you have to talk about racial, sexual justice at the same time.
John Russo, visiting scholar at the Kalmenovitz Initiative for Labor and Working Poor at Georgetown University, also managing editor of the blog Working Class Perspectives, and co-author with Sherry Lee Lincoln of Steeltown, Work and Memory in Youngstown. John, thank you so much for your time with us today on americasdemocrats.org. We look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Great. It was nice talking to you.
Yeah, and nice talking to you as well. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press talks with Joe Cirincione, president of the Plowshares Fund, on what to expect from a summit with the United States and why Donald Trump might actually succeed.
All right, here we go. Wrapping up here on Thursday, April 19, the Bill Press Show. Great to have you with us today. Again, urge you to check out the Hill newspaper today. I'll look at the Hill every day, but particularly today, thehill.com. Reporter Ben Camazar has a feature piece in there about me and about my new book, From the Left, A Life in the Crossfire. We've told you about it. You can find out more about it on our website at thebillpressshow.com. Joe Cirincione has read the entire book. He's here today.
It is
from the
on my
Plowshares
bedstand.
Fund.
I consult it regularly.
Hello, Joe. How are you?
What do you mean wrapping up? We're just getting started here.
We are. We're just getting started.
We're going to cover the rest of the world now.
Man, yes, and we've held back a lot waiting for you to get here. And Emma Roller still with us here from Splinter News, and here is a friend of Bill this hour. So, Joe, I mean, what is going on? It wasn't that long ago that we were going to obliterate North Korea.
Fire and fury.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
That's what they were going to feel.
I got a bigger button than you, and it works. Remember that?
Yes.
That's how we started the year.
Right. And now, suddenly, we're talking about sitting down with Kim Jong-un, or Kim Jong-un, as Donald Trump calls him. He always stretches it out like he can't
has
say
his own
the name.
unique style.
So why this sudden change, and is it for real?
I think it is for real, but you know how things are in the Trump administration. Everything's a circus act. It's a juggling pin, it's a plate, it's a watermelon. You never know what's going to come up next, right? And so this works for Donald Trump. That's the main thing. Having a summit, being presidential, being able to solve a problem that no one else has ever solved before, and he can do it. You heard him yesterday with Abe claiming credit, claiming that President Moon of South Korea said if it wasn't for President Trump, wasn't for me, he said, the Olympics would have been a failure. Mm-hmm. So it's all about him. It's all about his ability to solve problems. Well, you know what? It actually might work. There is a greater than zero chance that this summit could work. The Mike Pompeo visit, big news that just broke this week, shows that there have been serious talks going on between the United States and North Korea.
Were you surprised at the Pompeo visit?
Yes. Stunning. Nobody knew anything about this. As CIA director, he can fly to places secretly. And he used he used that in this case. This is a long-established channel. The intelligence services director Clapper actually opened this up and trying to negotiate the release of American prisoners or Americans held there, and they've kept it open. So yes, the Pompeo visit was significant in and of itself, and it shows that there is momentum towards a deal or deals with North Korea.
So you're saying that we might actually, that Donald Trump might actually succeed where Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama did not.
Yes. I've been privately assessing this summit possibility as 60-40, 60% complete catastrophe, 40% chance of success. I think that's now moved to 50-50 because it works for him and for Kim. Both of them are vesting a great deal in the success of this summit. So if it comes off, and that's an if it comes off, Trump might be willing to take small steps towards progress, establishment of a process towards denuclearization, and declare it a great victory. Once he realizes he's not going to fly to the summit and come home with Kim Jong-un's nuclear weapons in the cargo hold of his plane.
Which is not going to happen.
Not going to happen.
Sure. So how about what he said yesterday where he's sort of sending a message, or maybe it was bluster, I don't know, talking about the summit. Let's listen to him. He's not willing to say yet that it's a sure thing.
If I think that it's a meeting that is not going to be fruitful, we're not going to go. If the meeting when I'm there is not fruitful, I will respectfully leave the meeting.
Respectfully leave the meeting.
He'll bow his way out.
Well, this is the quantum uncertainty of the Trump administration. Is the summit alive or dead? We don't know. It's both. And we won't know until Donald Trump tweets about it.
Yeah, until they sit down.
Until they sit down.
Yeah.
This is obviously, we've said this over and over again, this is not normal.
But it is significant that Kim Jong-un has met, now he's going to China to meet with President Xi. He's meeting with the president of South Korea next week. He met with Mike Pompeo.
Yes.
It looks like at least on his side, right?
Kim Jong-un is smarter than we thought. He is calling the tune here, and Trump is dancing to his melody. This is what's going on here. He's handling this brilliantly.
I totally agree with you, particularly if you throw the Olympics in the mix.
Exactly, the whole thing. The way he did his tests, more tests last year than any Korean leader has ever done. He detonated a hydrogen bomb. He tested twice a missile that could reach the United States, got away with all of this. The sanctions didn't slow him down for a minute. The threats didn't stop him. And then, bang, turns on a dime with the peace offensive. We get the Olympics. We get his sister. We get all that. We get President Moon, wanting to meet. This meeting at the end of the month, April 27th, between the North and South Korean presidents could be extremely significant. They are raising the ante steadily. They're now talking about negotiating a peace arrangement, a peace agreement between North and South. Remember, the Korean War never ended, as President Trump reminded us. A lot of people don't know the Korean War never ended. We just have an armistice there, and we may actually end the Korean War in the next few months.
My question for you, Joe, is that how did we get from, as you said, the infamous button tweet and about the size of the relative buttons? That was just in January? Because it feels like it was years ago.
Well, it was 5 years ago in Trump years.
Right, exactly.
But it was just January.
But how did we get from that rhetoric to where we are now? Was it, do you see any turning points? Was it the Olympics? What was it?
It was Kim Jong-un. He declared on January 1st that they had accomplished their historic effort on the nuclear program. He said, we achieved it. And now, and he's always had, we're going to turn to our other goal. He's always had two goals, which is economics, which is to revive the economy, which isn't doing all that badly, as it turns out. But in order to really get it going, he needs to open up. He needs trade. He needs normalization of relations. He needs inflow of capital, and that's what he wants to do. So this is a very clear plan on his. And then in order to get that, in order to change the tone with the United States, he dangled denuclearization, which is what Trump said he wanted. We're not going to talk to them until they agree to get rid of his nuclear weapons.
Right.
So he came up with it's a longstanding phrase in the Korean Peninsula, denuclearization. It means something different for Kim than it does for Trump, but that's the art of diplomacy. You fudge over these differences, and Kim or his advisors were smart enough to figure out a way to do it.
So you say that it might work. What do we mean when we say it might work? Does that mean it doesn't mean unification of the Korean Peninsula, right?
No.
It doesn't mean, as you indicated, that Kim Jong-un would say we're just going to, like Gaddafi did, scrap all of our nuclear weapons program.
Right.
It means
This is not going to be the fall of the Berlin Wall. This is not going to be that. At the summits, I think we'll return to something more normal. And, we have 10, 20, 30 years of efforts to try to do these things. And so there's a well-worn path here. And we're probably going to have improved relations between the two Koreas. We'll probably have the establishment of a peace arrangement process that gets us going. And then with
ongoing talks beyond this.
And then if that works, then when Trump meets, you will probably get several gestures from Kim's side agreeing to a freeze, no more tests of missiles, no more tests of weapons, maybe a pause, a freeze of the production so I won't make any more, and a pledge to denuclearize as long as the United States takes what they call meaningful steps. And what they mean is reduce the exercises. They would like pledges not to threaten North Korea with nuclear weapons. So they want denuclearization on both sides of this relationship, and that will be a process, and that might work.
And trade deals might be part of it too?
Absolutely. It's always been part of the mix, economic assistance from the United States
to North Korea. Because North Korea gets everything from China, right?
90% of their trade. Yeah. But they would like to have a relationship. This is one of the things that people don't – I sound like Donald Trump. People don't understand that the North Koreans –
You remind me more and more of Donald Trump.
We're longer ties. That they want a balance against China. They don't like being that dependent on China. They have a very rocky history with China, so they would like some kind of strategic relationship with the United States.
Right. Where do you think this summit's going to take place?
That was one of the things that was unresolved.
I know. It seems to be a real sticky point because Kim Jong-un doesn't like to travel, and he doesn't have planes that can get him very far.
So, I mean, the obvious site is Seoul, but I don't think the North Koreans want to agree to that. He's not going to come to the United States, and Trump's not going to go to Pyongyang. Geneva, Europe, those are some possibilities.
How would he get there?
Well, that's true. He likes to take trains. China, I'm sure, has offered and would like it to be in China, but I don't think Kim wants that. So it's unresolved. If I had to guess, I would probably put it in the DMZ.
I was going to say maybe like a break room in the DMZ.
Well, this is where the North and South Korean leaders are meeting. They're meeting in what they call the Peace Village in the DMZ, which, by the way, is one of the things we're likely to see come out of the summit. We might actually demilitarize the demilitarized zone. Both countries have troops in the DMZ.
Yeah,
we might see an agreement to pull them out.
I'm thinking back to World War II days when FDR and Churchill and Stalin they met on ships. Warships,
right. Or in harbors. Yeah, that's right. They met on ships.
So maybe they could,
Would Kim Jong-un come to an aircraft carrier, an armada?
In the China Sea or something like that?
I don't know. I haven't heard anything about where this might happen. Still unresolved.
Right. And we don't have a time yet either. So they say May or June.
Exactly.
Right.
Depending. And, this is very rushed. Very rushed. I mean, all this started when the South Koreans came to visit at the beginning of March and extended the invitation, which had been extended to all presidents before this. And Trump, I don't think, knew that. He thought this was a personal honor to him, and he just impulsively seized on it and set all this in motion.
Well, whatever happens, most likely this whole thing will result in Mike Pompeo being confirmed as Secretary of State. Would you agree?
No. This is much closer than people think.
Really?
This is much. I mean, so
this is all orchestrated, don't you think?
The disclosure of the trip was almost certainly orchestrated to try to stem the flood of Democrats who were coming out
to give him some diplomatic cred.
Yes. But it didn't work because even after this announcement. So yesterday, Robert Menendez, the ranking Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, announces he won't do it. Ben Cardin, the guy right behind him, announces he won't do it. Jack Reed, the ranking Democrat on the House Armed Services Committee. Right now, Pompeo does not have a Democratic vote positively, either on committee or in the whole Senate. There are 2 or 3 that I think are very likely to vote for him. But if they don't, and with Rand Paul having declared against him, and with Jeff Flake undecided, this is a 1 or 2 vote nomination. He's almost certainly is going to be voted out of committee with a recommendation of disapproval. First time this is
disapproval.
Yes, he will not make it out of the committee.
But are there enough Republicans to give him?
No, there are not, because Rand Paul is going to vote against him, and so far all the Democrats have declared against. I think there's only one left, Coons. And if he goes, that's it. Then he will not get approval. First time a nomination for the Secretary of State has come out of a Senate committee with the vote of disapproval since 1925, which is when they began taking votes.
Whoa.
Wow.
Here is Rand Paul yesterday putting himself on the line.
He's talked recently of coming home from Syria. He seems to be consistently against, engaging in a new large land war in the Middle East. And I haven't gotten the feeling that Director Pompeo sort of agrees with that.
So he says he's even out of step with Donald Trump.
Yeah. And so I was up on the Hill yesterday.
I must say, I don't trust Rand Paul.
He could
Rand
flip.
Paul could easily change his mind.
You just saw Jeff Flake flip on a vote yesterday. He was initially against, then he...
You mean on Pompeo?
No, on the vote for another one of Donald Trump's nominees. It was locked at 49-49. It was going to fail, and he flipped to pass it. So you never know. You never know. I was up on the Hill last couple of days talking to Senate staffers and senators, and I think that their assumption is your assumption, that it will get through, however barely. But it's closer than people think, and the the civic groups, the citizen groups are mounting a ferocious campaign against this. MoveOn.org, Indivisible, Credo, many others, Vote Vets, are just flooding members with emails, phone calls, ads against Pompeo. So it's one more disclosure of a shady business deal with the Chinese, which is in Pompeo's past, could flip the vote.
What's the case against Pompeo? Just inexperience, too bellicose?
Bellicose, prone to go to war. Ben Cardin, who voted against the Iran deal, cited Pompeo's inability to work with our allies to try to keep the Iran deal, a lack of experience. So even senators who voted for him for CIA director because of his intelligence background are voting against him for Secretary of State because of his lack of international experience and his bellicosity.
What is the status of, a little separately, of the Gina Haspel nomination?
Also hanging by a thread. I mean, in some ways, she's in more jeopardy. I mean, she has not satisfactorily answered a lot of senators' questions about the destruction of the interrogation tapes, about her conduct and approval of and participation in waterboarding and other torture techniques. So this is all. None of his nominees are having an easy go of it at this point.
Hard to believe that Gina Haspel still, I find it hard to believe, maybe not from Donald Trump, but that a person who is in charge of one of these black sites and actually overseeing waterboarding, it's just a direct violation of the Geneva Conventions and U.S. law as well, would be named CIA director.
Right. Well, of course, she was kept on. She was deputy director.
Yeah.
So none of the people who participated in these tortures have suffered the consequences of this, whereas the people who called them out, who blew the whistle on them, have been dismissed, shuffled to other positions.
All right. Now, this is Thursday, so we're not sure what the policy from the White House will be today on whether or not we are going to pull our troops out of Syria or leave them in Syria. Maybe it depends on whether or not he talked to Emmanuel Macron within the last 24 hours. How would you assess the impact of the cruise missile attack on Syria? Mission accomplished?
Symbolic. Totally symbolic. 100 missiles. Remember, we heard originally 150, which is why you never believe the first reports from the front. So about 100 destroyed 3 sites. I don't think anyone was killed. I may have missed it, but I think the original reports was no one was killed, no Russians
Hard
killed.
to believe, but I haven't heard of any fatalities at all.
Russians did not engage these missiles. So they
had promised they were going to shoot them down.
Yeah, claims.
Yeah, right.
They shut down. Not the first time a nation state has claimed they intercepted missiles when they actually didn't. And so there's more of a story here that people are looking at. What exactly was the communication with the Russians? Why didn't they engage? Was there a deal with the Russians before the strikes? So there's something more to dig up here that might come out. But just on a military level, did it affect the conduct of the war? No, it did not. This was basically a 36-hour story. It broke on Friday night. The Sunday papers dominated the front pages of those papers. But after that, by Sunday morning talk shows, it was all over. Syria, all over. They had pictures of Assad striding calmly through his presidential palace. The war goes on.
Right. But what was accomplished? Nothing at all, do you think? Just sending a message?
A brushback. It's like, an inside pitch to a batter that pushes them off the plate. You probably pushed Assad back. There haven't been reports of chemical weapons use. Remember, we're talking about chlorine gas, which is it's the first chemical weapon. This is what the Germans used against the British in World War I. It's just chlorine gas, and it's a dual-use chemical. You can't really ban it. Anything that's producing chlorine for swimming pools could produce chlorine for a bomb very quickly.
Can't you make chlorine gas accidentally by mixing together bleach and ammonia?
That's a very good point.
I think you can't mix certain cleaning products together, or they'll
There were chemicals in our house that are toxic. They're good. So Will the Syrians not use this again? No, this is true. This is just true. Chlorine is just a compound of two other simple chemicals.
Which are the two?
I believe it's bleach and ammonia.
If you combine they
don't
have the
Carol.
compounds. Yeah, don't use both
I won't be
when
safe.
cleaning your toilet. Do not use both. so a little brushback, but most of the killing has been done by good old regular bombs, not chemical gas.
And so, bottom line, the civil war goes on.
Yeah.
With Russia and Iran supporting Syria, and we have 2,000 troops in Syria, and ISIS is almost out of territory. So what are we doing, and how long do we stay?
Right. So
what really has changed in the big picture? Like nothing, right?
Nothing. And Donald Trump keeps, again, quantum uncertainty. Does he want them in? Does he want them out? We don't know. And your interview with Kevin Barron a couple of days ago, which I listened to in detail, was one of the best interviews I've heard on this. And you heard firsthand.
That's thanks to Kevin, not to me. But anyway.
You had him on. You were asking the questions. You were pressing him. And talking to Kevin, who doesn't have a dog in this
great reporter,
fight.
Executive editor of Defense One.
Right. And he just lays it out for you, the case for staying. Mm-hmm. That we control and our allies control about 1/3 of Syria. And if you pull the troops out, you could destabilize that. So when a commander-in-chief is confronted with this, when the cabinet members were members of Congress, when a radio show interviewer is confronted with this, it's very hard to say, okay, pull them out. I'm willing to risk that. The short-term loss is clear, and the long-term gain is ephemeral. So it's very, very hard for policymakers to pull the plug on war, to say get out. And you saw it demonstrated by that talk with Kevin.
But, and as we were talking with Kevin, and you and I've talked before too, is that seems that's the problem with all of these military engagements. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, we get in and we can't get out.
The flypaper problem. You're stuck. And you feel it. When you go into the nitty-gritty details, you feel it. I mean, I'm with you. I think we should get out. I don't want us there for a whole lot of reasons, including I do not believe that U.S. military force can fundamentally change the dynamics of the Middle East, period. This is not the way we solve it. There is no diplomatic or political strategy to go along with this military mission. What are we doing there except killing people, including the casualties on our own side? We should get out. But actually getting out is extraordinarily difficult.
To me, it's so lopsided, where the first line of argument or attack is immediately strikes, while not thinking about soft power aspects, humanitarian aid. As I said earlier in the show, the U.S. has only let in 11 Syrian refugees so far this year. Can you talk a little bit about the Trump administration's perhaps failure to...
It is a racist, bigoted policy. 2 years ago, we let in 15,000 Syrians, right? We have a cap of 96,000 refugees. Well, we can, according to our own rules and regulations, that's how many we can let in. 11 Syrians? Really?
And it also makes...
It's inhumane. It is just inhumane. Mm-hmm. There's no defense for that.
Because
that
the idea that
anybody
coming from Syria is automatically ISIS.
Right.
That's the Trump belief.
Right. It's this sort of cognitive dissonance of, showing these horrible photos of, children and families, and the Trump administration expressing sympathy for that. But at the same time, they are systemically not allowing them to seek refuge on our shores.
Right. This is a president who is psychologically incapable of showing empathy. I mean, the closest we get to it is reaction to photos, as we've learned. But that's it. To actually let people in, nope, sorry, wrong color, wrong country, not coming in.
And with that little bit of good news, we wrap up here today for this Thursday. That's really, really sad.
Yeah.
It really is. But speaks volumes about Donald Trump himself and the administration. Hey, Joe, great to see you. Plowshares, plowshares.org, P-L-O-U-G-H, shares.org, and splinternews.com. Have a great day, folks.
That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Annelise Orleck, John Russo, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.